Khan. I guess I had a responsibility of Maureen to introduce Koredawa, and that's Nausheen, you know, she was a research associate at PRI, but we never had the privilege of having Maureen here. So আমি একটু ডক্টর মাহিনকে ইন্ট্রোডিউস করে দিয়ে শুরু করি। So Mahin did his PhD from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. এবং আমি already বলেছি যে MIT is a top-rated institution in the world, top 3 or top 5 institution university যদি ধরা হয়, MIT is one of them, and যারা MIT থেকে PhD করে বেরোয়। বাংলাদেশে আমাদের বোধহয় MIT PhD খুবই কম আছে, 2-3 জন। ডক্টর আনিসুর রহমান অনেক আগে উনি ছিলেন, তারপরে এরপরে একজন আরো MIT থেকে PhD করেছে। So Dr. Murray is a young budding economist with a PhD from MIT. She has a great future ahead of us, and আমার মনে হয় Bangladesh will be benefited from her research and her international experience. Right now she's working for the Oxford University. She has huge amount of research করছিল। আমি এখনই দেখছি, I'm sure, she must be spending 20 hours a day doing research. আমার একটা যেটা রিসার্চ প্রথমে যেটা অ্যাট্রাক্ট করলো সেটা হচ্ছে এই যে যেটাকে বলছি transnational labor governance. You see, this is related to what is happening with globalization. Okay, অনেকে মনে করেন যে globalization is dead, globalization is dead. I don't believe it. Globalization is irreversible. At worst, যে সিঙ্গাপুরের যে senior minister বলছেন, we will continue to have globalization with the world -1. -1 টা কি এটা আপনারা বুঝতে পারেন। So globalization will continue. এবং গ্লোবালাইজেশনের যে একটা বড় আইটেম আছে সেটা হচ্ছে সাপ্লাই চেইন as the sort of complement to globalization. তো এই সাপ্লাই চেইন ডেভেলপমেন্টে এখানে যে একটা নতুন আইডিয়া যেটা আমি দেখলাম ডক্টর মারিনের রিসার্চে, লেবার গভর্নেন্সটা, মানে সাপ্লাই চেইন মানে you have multiple countries within which value addition is taking place, and you trade in value added, you trade in finished products as well as intermediate products. So এখানে কিন্তু শুধু ডোমেস্টিক ন্যাশনাল লেবার গভর্নেন্সের কথা বলছে না, বাট ট্রান্সন্যাশনাল লেবার গভর্নেন্স, মানে সাপ্লাই চেইন যদি এফেক্টিভলি চলতে হয় in a globalized trading environment, trading and investment environment. So she's looking at what kind of labor governance would be required for an effective value chain integration. And the fact of the matter is, in the past 25 years, trade in intermediate goods, trade in value added, that has been rising very fast. এবং এই যে গ্লোবালাইজেশন স্লো ডাউন হচ্ছে তাতেও কিন্তু এই সাপ্লাই চেইন ইন্টিগ্রেশন কিন্তু কমে whatever data we have. So I'd like to just say that we really have a very promising rising young economist, and actually Bangladesh's future is with the young people, with the youth. Our average age, median age is I think 27, so Bangladesh is a young country, and it's the young people who will determine Bangladesh's future. Dr. Maureen Khan will certainly be one of them.
Assalamu alaikum shabaike, shubha aparanno. Thank you to the Millennium University for letting me be the guest speaker at today's event. It's a very important and critical event. And unfortunately, I think probably I'm mainly only qualified to talk about the economy. And thank you, Dr. Sattar, for a very generous introduction, generous and long introduction. I hope I can live up to your expectations. And thank you most importantly for giving us a broad macroeconomics overview of our country and how it relates to the current political economy. But right now, I'm going to actually bring you down one level. I'm going to talk about governance and human capital, Mano Shampod. And I'm going to tell you why it is critical to think about the people if we want to think about political economy, if we want to think about governance, and we want to think about economic stability for Bangladesh as we move forward. And this is important because we have to remember governance, we must not confuse governance with government. Governance is a much bigger concept. Governance is about labor governance. Governance is about governing data security, IT, and AI. It's about governing our private sector, and it's also about our public sector. So when we think about governance, we must go beyond thinking about just our government. And this is why we need to think about human capital, which is our workers. And thank you. We have a very critical person who is working day to day in the work of human capital here. So thank you, Mr. Mashu, for also being here. And you can hopefully give us some critical feedback on some of these issues. So Dr. Sattar has already given us an overview of Bangladesh's economy. We are really at a critical juncture today. We are at the cusp of becoming a middle-income country. We are blessed, I will say, with a very large population, officially at least 175 million, but probably a lot more. This is a blessing because these people are our assets. This is one of the world's largest labor force. We introduce about 2 million workers into the labor market each year. Unfortunately, however, most of these workers are going into what is known as the informal economy. So these are not jobs most of us go into the office to do. And I will tell you a little bit more about the distribution in a second. Dr. Sattar told us about our economic reliance on exports, which is primarily driven by the garment sector. This is a really important sector, and I will very soon tell you why it's additionally important. And then more importantly, we rely on what we call directly human capital, remittances from migrant workers. Again, we need to think about this migration in a very careful and thoughtful way as we think about the future of Bangladesh. So the question today for us is how can we align competitiveness, worker outcomes, and political stability as we go into this next growth phase? Let me start with some of these visual images from the world from the last few years. You will recognize the first one. That's from Bangladesh, from less than a year and a half ago. Those are our young people leading the revolution. But Bangladesh is not the only country to have had a revolution. We are probably one of the only countries to have had a successful revolution led by young people. But overall, there have been protests in Nepal, Philippines, Kenya, Madagascar, and Iran more recently. Not everyone was successful, but we were. And part of it relates to our governance structure. But of course, these revolts have been due to, a lot of it has been because of ideological reasons, because we want democratic freedom. We want to be able to speak our mind. We want to be able to elect our people in a free and fair way. However, if you really look at the core of the problem, it is more than ideological. At the core of it, it's an economic problem. Most of it is about getting jobs, and getting good jobs. If you are a university graduate, or you're coming out of vocational training, but you've spent time, you've spent your money, you have spent the hard-earned earnings of your parents, or your relatives to go into a good university education, but you're unable to get a job 1, 2, 3 years later, what happens? You become frustrated. You want to revolt. You want to revolt against the system that prevents you from getting those jobs. So that's why we have seen this all over the world. Therefore, I will say that labor or workers are the most critical dimension for democracy, governance, and economic stability. So if you look at the top, this is a cycle. This is not a linear path. So you have labor markets. These labor markets need to be governed well. People need to be able to get jobs. They need to get earned wages that are in line with the level of education they have. And therefore, and these need to be inclusive jobs. Women need to get jobs. Young people need to get jobs. They should not depend on what kind of connections I have in this world or in this country. When you have good jobs, when you have well-functioning, transparent labor markets where if I go on BD Jobs and I apply to a job, I can get called to that interview, not because who I called or who my dad called or who my uncle called to get that job. These will drive good economic outcomes, productivity, good levels of export. It will lead to household security. And when that happens, we will have a society which has social cohesion and trust. Trust is the missing component we have right now. And when this happens, we will have good political systems. We will have good elections. This is the positive cycle that we want Bangladesh to be on. Unfortunately, currently we have been in a negative cycle. So I will say that labor or workers are central to not only economic competitiveness or poverty reduction, but also social stability. Since our birth, Bangladesh has relied on having a labor-intensive growth. We have relied on cheap labor, but we need to make sure that this model becomes resilient and sustainable. We cannot just rely on cheap labor anymore as we go into the future. So you might ask, what does the Bangladesh labor market look like today? What does our population look like today? So Dr. Sattar told us about agricultural sector. He told us about RMG. Agriculture is indeed very important. Despite its low contribution to GDP, you can see that almost half of the people are probably employed in agriculture. A fifth of the people are in manufacturing. Most of it is in the garment sector. And this is an important sector. I will soon tell you why. And then we have a growing services sector. Unfortunately, most of the work in agriculture and services, so services means a lot of SMEs, most of these shops on the side of the road, agriculture workers who work on day wage, these are in the informal economy. So most of these do not get counted, or people do not get proper benefits that you would have as if you would be working in the formal economy. And then, if you've probably seen the changing pyramid on the right, what it showed is the evolution of our population. So now in 2025, we basically have a population which is both men, for men and women, it is a huge population that is going into the labor market. So if you think about the labor market, we have high informality, a youth-heavy workforce, and then on top of that, we have gender segmentation. So when we speak about gender segmentation, the first thing that comes to mind is the Bangladesh garment sector. We are all very familiar with the image of our garment sector. It's thousands and thousands of women going into factories to work. That is the first image we think of when we think of Bangladesh's RMG sector. This RMG sector has grown significantly in the last 40 years. As you can see on the left, look at how much our export earnings have grown over the years. We almost rely predominantly just on RMG as one of our main exports. This is a problem in itself from a macroeconomic perspective, but I won't do a deep dive into that because I will talk about the workers. Look at how many workers it employs. Over the few decades, the number of people it employs has grown significantly. The last estimate is about 4 million. But I can tell you as an economist, it is very unfortunate that when I went to look up these numbers, proper numbers on this does not exist in our data set. The actual number count of workers in this sector does not exist. This is a major gap for Bangladesh. We need to be able to count the people who are in this sector to the last dot, because every worker matters. But go back to the picture that I painted for you. When you think of RNG, you think of women walking to work, walking back from work. But is this really true? What is the paradox in this sector? So, in 1980, it is true that over 80% estimated of the workers were women, but this has been declining. If you look at more recent estimates, it puts the proportion of women workers in this sector between 50 and 60%. Why? We need to understand why are women leaving this sector. There are many, many important reasons for this. This is socially, there are cultural norms where women leave the workforce early. But this should not be the cause of having fewer women working in this sector. One of the major issues is that the career progression for women in this sector is almost negligible. So, if you look at this graph, this shows you the proportion of workers by gender amongst different categories of jobs in the garment occupation. So you have workers, you have managers, and you have staff. As you can see, most of the women, almost close to 100% of the women, are workers. They never really get promoted into a managerial level. This is not true for men. If you're a man, it's a 10 times higher chance that you will become a manager. So what is happening to the careers of women who go into this profession? Basically, nothing. They stop at being a worker. But this is not a negative story for us. This is not a negative story for Bangladesh. I'll give you a couple of good examples from the sector that should make us hope that we can do better. I will tell you this first example. This is from an IFC-funded program that was essentially a CSR program. The goal of this program was to promote workers into supervisory positions. And this program training was actually mainly targeted to build leadership skills. And do you know why? It's because the previous studies showed that women are not less technically qualified. Women are able to technically do the job, but it's the social norms that hold us back. When women are trained to be better leaders, to be strong managers, they actually do well. Not only do they do well, they actually surpass the men after 2 years in terms of productivity. So lines that are managed by women are actually more productive than the lines that are managed by their male supervisory counterparts. And if you look at that graph, in the factory, so orange is after the program, blue is before the program. In factories that implemented this program, the proportion of female supervisors as a ratio to the male supervisors actually increased. And why did it increase? It's because the senior factory management realized that women are good managers. The workers, our surveys showed that workers working under the women were actually happier with their female supervisors. This is an important learning, and we need to translate this into more and more factories, not just in the RMG sector, but beyond that. I have a second example. This is also a positive example from the garment sector. In 2013, we had one of the worst industrial disasters, not just for Bangladesh, but in the world. The Rana Plaza disaster. It killed over 1,100 workers, and it maimed many more, and there were huge changes to this industry. I was working in that sector at the time, before my PhD. People were worried. Many industrialists, our policymakers, were worried that our industry might end, but it didn't. Our garment sector and our workers are extremely resilient. What you see here is the improvement in the level of safety in the factories. So these are for a certain the largest proportion of factories that were covered under the Accord Agreement. The level of safety in the factories went from 20 to nearly 90%. So we can actually do better. And this is a positive example that we can take forward. But what's the role of governance here? It's very important. The reason why the Accord, and then which later became the RMG Sustainability Council, all private sector led. Why were these important governance structures that we can think about in other sectors? The Accord was unique because it increased worker voice. In their governance structure, they brought in workers who are generally left out of governance processes. They brought the workers in to have a say. And then what the RSC did, they did even better. They balanced out the economic powers between the global north and the global south. They brought in the local RMG makers into the governance structure. Historically, we have been told what to do by the West and we have followed. But these new types of transnational labor governance mechanisms actually level the playing field, making better compliance and long-term sectoral resilience. So what does the garment sector teach us that we can take to other sectors of our country? And why is it important for political economy? We need to understand that participation is not the main constraint for women in our country, but their position is. We need to find pathways for them to have adequate career transitions. And this means we need policies that protect workers. Despite what the recent debate has shown, we don't need to reduce the number of workers women can work. We actually need to give them more opportunities to work more. Because when women work more, they are very, very productive. Policies like maternity leave, ensuring that there is equality between men and women in the household, that's what we need to focus on. And there are policies that can make that difference. We also need to be able to enforce laws that we already have. We don't need to create new laws and new regulations. We need to enforce what we already have in place. And our evidence from various gender initiatives at workplaces show that when women work, they are productive, and then women and the workers under them are happy. So in order to do that, we need credible institutions, and we need impartial and trust between firms and the workers, and we need to be able to build that. This brings me to the next important segment of the workforce. These are the young people that I mentioned at the start of my presentation. I said that the workers today are unhappy because they're unable to do their work. I am not making this up. A World Bank study in 2019 showed that almost a third of graduates from university and polytechnics were unemployed 1 to 2 years after their graduation. So you can imagine what kind of frustration that creates in our economy. In the same study, when they interviewed the employers and asked them, can you identify skills that you think are important that may not be available amongst the current graduates, they identified a number of skills. As you can see, computer skills, unsurprisingly, is one of the big ones. Work ethic is another big one. Management, time management, critical thinking. Our education systems do not encourage critical thinking. So all of these soft skills that should be part of our education system is currently not part of the system. And most importantly, language and communication. So these are all the skills that the employers wish their workers had, but still do not seem to be there. So this brings us to why it is important for young people to get jobs, why that's important for economic stability. when employment is not just an economic issue, when we are able to match skills to what is needed in the economy, then we reduce informality and we create jobs which create credibility for governance systems. This now brings me to the biggest human resource that we have. These are our migrant workers. Studying labor migration was one of the big areas of my research during my PhD. I went to many training sessions at the Mirpur TTC to understand what kind of training they were getting before they left. I spoke to many of them to understand the kind of problems they were facing and what the policy failings were. And it was heartbreaking because these trainings, which are designed to protect our workers, were basically ineffective. And actually, a number of World Bank studies around the world show that the tons of money that are spent by governments on training and information sessions are basically ineffective. And do you know why? It's because by the time they get to those training sessions, the damage has already been done. If you look at migration by gender, basically, we now only export, to use a very crude word, male workers. We barely send any women abroad, and if we do, they're mainly as domestic workers to Saudi Arabia. And this has happened since 2015, since our government made an agreement with them. This is a major, major failing for our country. Philippines are neighboring countries in the region. They have been sending care workers to countries in Western Europe and other countries with aging populations like Japan and other countries by upskilling their women, by upskilling them to not become domestic workers, but to be proper care workers with proper language skills, so they're able to do a higher skills job. Despite these examples, we have focused on the lower end of the labor market. If you look at the skill distribution of workers, essentially the gray line, which is basically lower unskilled workers, that's essentially the majority of the workers going out from Bangladesh. If you go transit through Doha or any of those Middle Eastern countries, you will get bad glances from the locals. And this is because they associate Bangladeshis with the lowest level of work in their countries. We need to go beyond this. We need to go from the gray bar to the blue bar, or to the yellow bar, or even beyond that. We need to upskill our migrant workers. I studied the last few 5-year plans of our country. Our country takes immense pride in sending workers abroad. We have focused on quantity, not quality. This is a major, major policy failing. And I was deeply, deeply disappointed by the fact that we have not gone into upskilling our migrant workers. I mapped out from BMET's data, where do our workers go? If you look at the different colors, it shows you the percentage of workers going to the different countries. Dark blue means very little, yellow and orange means very high. So this is from 2009. In 2009, we were sending a large proportion of workers to many countries around Saudi Arabia and North Africa, but there were also workers going to Italy, there were workers going to Southeast Asia, and you have to keep in mind, many of the work jobs in Southeast Asia, like Singapore and Malaysia, tend to be more middle skilled jobs. They're often in engineering, they get proper adequate training before they migrate. Now, what happens in 2019? If you look at 2019, essentially the majority of workers are concentrated, the largest proportion of workers are concentrated in Saudi Arabia. Now, why is this a problem? This is because we, instead of diversifying the countries that we send our workers to, we have concentrated them into a few select countries where the opportunities are not only low skilled, they work in very dire conditions and unsafe conditions. So 50 to 60% of migrants in Saudi Arabia tend to be in low skilled jobs like construction, cleaning, and domestic support roles. What we need from a policy perspective are strong bilateral or multilateral agreements into higher skilled occupations like care work. The green transition is one of the biggest things that most countries globally are looking into. The green transition requires low-level engineers for electrification, for changing gas to electricity. Why can we not send more workers into these jobs? They don't have the people, we do. We should be sending them into these jobs. We need to be sending people into IT and tech services. We all hear about AI. We need to learn how to leverage AI, not be a victim of AI. So, the first point is, we cannot limit our destination countries. Dr. Sattar mentioned Nikkei in Japan. We need to make more agreements like that, where we focus on sending our workers to good, high-skilled jobs, not low-skilled jobs where they are victimized and where they are made to suffer. Secondly, we need to think about economic returns and constraints and barriers to migration. By limiting our migrant workers to countries like Saudi Arabia, we have limited their economic returns. These are low-wage jobs, 25 to 30,000 per month. People should not have to leave Bangladesh to get this type of earning. Why are they spending so much money to go into these jobs? If you look at recent studies by World Bank, Bangladeshi migrant workers pay some of the highest costs in the region, $4,000, $5,000. This is beyond the capacity of most people. So they have to sell assets, they have to go into debt with loan sharks often, not even proper financial facilities. And this means that even when they go into that training session and realize that they are going to go into a job that's not the job that they have been promised, they have no choice. They have to go and pay back the loan shark, or they have to go and pay back their relative who gave them the money. So you see people who are dejected, they are scared, and yet they still go to these jobs. So we need to find ways of making capital accessible for these people. We need to enforce policies so that we don't only have leaflets that tell people what the maximum cost of migration should be, but we actually have policies that enforce these costs. And finally, we all brag about remittances. We sit in these rooms and we brag about remittances. But where are these remittances going? What is it being used for? My PhD study showed, unfortunately, despite our claims that remittances are creating amazing development activities around the country, the evidence does not actually show that to be the case. So where are these hard-earned remittances going? We need to think about it. I hope they're not sitting in Swiss accounts globally. And finally, what this means is we need to think about the governance gaps and the risk to the workers who are going there. And this is absolutely critical, and it's entirely political economy. It is entirely governance. We need to think about creating training that is not just a checkbox. We need to create training programs that actually create the right kind of support for the workers. As policymakers, we have done one great thing. We have created a labor cell in consulates in destination countries. But have you ever asked a migrant worker if they have been to one of those labor cells, if they have talked to a single person there? They'll tell you they tried to call the consulate and couldn't reach through to any of them. Or they tried to go to the consulate and they were turned away. Ask a Filipino worker what they do when they have an issue. They get the full support of their consulate when they go there with a problem. So instead of supporting our migrant workers, we let them loose, we let them defend themselves. We don't take responsibility for them when they are in those countries. So we need to do better as policymakers. We don't need to try to send more people abroad. We need to take care of the people who are going abroad. So finally, let's tie it all back. Why is it related to elections? Why is labor related to elections? Why is labor related to the governance system? Why is it related to our greater economy? So if you look at this quadrant, Bangladesh is currently, or has been for the last few decades, basically stuck in the bottom half of this diagram, where we have essentially a low trust system. Our last few elections have been basically just a farce. We have had contested legitimacy. Our labor markets is somewhere between being informal and formal. So in some sectors there is higher levels of formality, but in some sectors it's essentially low productivity in formal sectors. What this means is that we have had economic growth, but we have had it without any trust in the economic system. We have been in somewhat of an instability trap that has led to the kind of revolution we saw a year and a half ago. We need to aspire to be in the bottom, top right corner. That is the desired path where we want to be on, where we have credible elections, where we have high trust systems, where we have accountable governance systems, with inclusive labor markets, which are productive and where the skills are adequately aligned with the needs. So, I leave you now with a few open questions. So the first, around governance and politics. Can our elections reinforce institutional credibility and legitimacy and not just authority? In terms of workforce, how can we leverage our rich private sector in order to get skills that are appropriate? And these could be soft skills, it could be hard skills, but we need the right skills. And to do that, skill training should not be led by the government. It should be led by the private sector who need those skills. And finally, sustainable growth. How can it be equitable and inclusive for all workers, not only a few segment of them, but everyone? Thank you so much. I will end here and leave it open for discussions.
এখন আমি বক্তব্য রাখবেন ইন্টারন্যাশনাল চেম্বারের মাহবুবুর রহমান সাহেব। ওনার পরিচয় তো উনি নিজেই, সুতরাং ওনাকে আলাদা। তো এই মাহারিম যে কথাগুলি বলেছে, এখানে ইন্টারন্যাশনাল চেম্বারের একটা ভীষণ রোল আছে। আমরা একটু শুনতে চাই যে কিভাবে ইন্টারন্যাশনাল চেম্বার এই আমাদের দেশের অর্থনীতি বা এইভাবে একটা ভূমিকা রাখতে পারে।
আপনি এটা ওভার লাঞ্চ যদি করেন তাহলে হয়তো বলা যাবে। আর আজকে স্টেক্সও আমি পাবো না, বিকজ আমি এখন বলে বাংলাদেশ ব্যাংকে জড়িত, তো আমার স্টেক্স আপনি ওটার জন্য শোনার জন্য আমি মেনে যতগুলো জিনিস উঠিয়ে নিয়ে এসছি সেগুলো নিয়ে আমার সামনে কথা বলতে পারবো অবশ্যই। ইচ ওয়ান অফ দি পয়েন্টস দ্যাট শি রেফার্ড, সে অক্সফোর্ডে থেকে এত কিছু জানো কি? But nevertheless, these are all pressing issues. These are all pressing issues as such. আমাদেরকে এগুলো নিয়ে আলোচনা করতে হবে, সেমিনার হবে, সিম্পোজিয়াম হবে, সরকারের কাছে দরবার আমরা করব। কিন্তু আমার মনে হয় যে sometime we feel too little too late. But nevertheless, we should have to go ahead. তো আপনি বলছেন যে ওয়ে ফরওয়ার্ড আমাদেরকে দিতেই হবে, নো চয়েস। অ্যাজ সাচ রেডিমেড গার্মেন্টস উপরে আমাদের ওভার ডিপেন্ডেন্স রয়েছে, এটা আমরা সবাই বলতেছি। বাট অ্যাট দ্য সেম টাইম দে আর দি কি বলে খাওয়ার ব্যবস্থা তো তারাই করতেছে। অ্যাজ সাচ রেডিমেড গার্মেন্ট ইন্ডাস্ট্রির প্রতিনিধি তো আমাদের কাছে আছে, শুধু বাংলাদেশে ইলেক্টেড নয় না, উনি কিন্তু আবার রেডিমেড গার্মেন্টের থেকে এবং টেক্সটাইলে নাম্বার ওয়ান এক্সপোর্টার অফ দ্য কান্ট্রি হয়েছে একে আজাদ। Nevertheless, the chairperson of the session, Advocate Roxana Khodkar and Dr. Jayadi Sattar and Dr. Mehrin Khan and Janab Dr. Moeen Khan, and all the distinguished members present here today. Thank you very much for inviting me, but I am not an expert in the economy or otherwise, neither in the economy nor in the politics. Here I am Dr. Namulis, Dr. Tawfiq. সেখানে ডক্টর তৌফিক এগুলোর উপরে কিছু কথাবার্তা বলবে। আমাকে এখন মোটামুটিভাবে আমি একটু ফিক্সড আমি নিয়ে এসেছি। এটা আমি একটু পড়ে শুনে তাদের একটু সুবিধা হবে, because I am not an expert on this, but nevertheless I am going to give you little points for food for thought. It's a privilege for me to be here today to speak at this important seminar jointly organized by the Millennium University and also the Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. I would like to thank the organizers for creating this platform for dialogue at a moment when Bangladesh stands at a critical crossroad, politically, economically, and institutionally. The theme of today's discussion, election, politics, and economy of Bangladesh, the way forward. যেহেতু 12 তারিখে আমাদের ইলেকশন, আমরা সবাই মনে করি যে এখন খালি ইলেকশনের কথাবার্তাই আমাদের মনের মধ্যে আসবে এবং আসা উচিত বটে। এবং ইয়েস ভোটের প্রমোশন বলছেন এখন হবে ইয়েস ভোটের প্রমোশন আমরা করতেছি। আমাদের যে ধরনের রেফারেন্ডাম আমরা তৈরি করেছি ইন ভেরি শর্ট টাইম, এর মধ্যে আসলে ভোটারদের কাছে জিনিসটা পৌঁছাতে অনেক সময় লেগে গেছে। এই সময় এর মধ্যে কি রেজাল্ট আসবে we do not know, but nevertheless we should work towards it. The election, politics and economy of Bangladesh, the way forward, is not just an academic or policy question. It is a national concern. It speaks directly to the future of our democracy, the resilience of our economy, and the confidence of our citizens, as well as our global partners. Ladies and gentlemen, around the world, history has shown us the political stability and economic progress are deeply interconnected. Markets thrive on predictability, confidence, and trust. Investors, both domestic and foreign, do not look only at growth figures, they look at governance quality, rule of law, institutional credibility, and above all, the legitimacy of political processes. Bangladesh elections are therefore not merely a constitutional requirement, they are also an economic signal. A credible, participatory and peaceful electoral process sends a strong message to investors, development partners and trading counterparts that Bangladesh is committed to stability, accountability, transparency and continuity. Conversely, prolonged political uncertainty raises risk of increases in the cost of capital, weakens currency confidence and slows investment decisions. Let us also acknowledge where Bangladesh stands today. Over the past 2 decades, Bangladesh has achieved economic progress, sustained growth, poverty reduction, export expansion, and impressive social indicators. These achievements did not happen by chance. They are the result of entrepreneurship, labor competitiveness, and policy continuity, and particularly our local investors has made a difference in the private sector. However, the global environment has changed. We are facing post-pandemic economic adjustments, inflationary pressure, global supply chain disruptions, geopolitical tensions, and the impending challenges of LDC graduation. At this juncture, Bangladesh needs strong institutions more than ever, institutions that can absorb shocks, manage transitions, and maintain policy credibility regardless of political cycles. From the perspective of the business and investment community, let me highlight 3 critical expectations from the upcoming government. First, political predictability. Businesses can adapt to policy changes, but they struggle with uncertainty. Clear timeliness, transparent processes, and adherence to norms, reduce risk of perception, and encourage long-term investment. Second, institutional independence. Key economic institutions such as the central bank, regulatory authorities, and the judiciary must operate independently and professionally. Investor confidence depends not on personalities but on systems. Third, inclusive dialogue. Economic reforms work best when they are inclusive. Policymakers, political actors, businesses, labor representatives, and civil society must engage in continuous dialogue. Elections should not disrupt this dialogue. They should stagnate. At one interaction with our chief advisor with the private sector, he said he stands for the workers, not for the investors. I do not know in the public discourse if you say like this, so how you are thinking that investors, both local and foreign, is going to come forward. Very, very unfortunate, but nevertheless, he has already signed 2 or 3 protocols of the ILO, which was not even signed by the United States by themselves. And why it is in a hurry? And now, number of protocols are going to be signed before the 12th of February. I understand the European Union is ready for the signing of the agreement on the 9th of February. I do not know whom they have discussed about the potentials and the necessity of doing things in a hurry. Ladies and gentlemen, democracy is often discussed as a political ideal, but let me say this clearly, democracy is also an economic asset. Transparent governance reduces corruption. A free media improves accountability, independent institutions reduce policy volatility, and citizen participation strengthens social cohesion. For a country like Bangladesh, deeply integrated into global trade, reliant on export markets, and aspiring to attract high-quality investment, these democratic attributes are not optional, they are essential. So what is the way forward? From business perspective, the path ahead requires collective responsibility. Political actors must prioritize national interest over short-term gains. Institutions must uphold professionalism and neutrality. Civil society and academia must continue to provide constructive and implementable suggestions and discussions and ideas that has to see the reality of the day. Money launderers and bank looters must be punished. I fully endorse the demand made by the Association of Bankers of Bangladesh to publish the names and photographs of those who siphoned off an estimated 234 billion from Bangladesh. Media should also play a neutral, independent role to convey people's view. Efforts must be made to manage competition, and the business community must advocate not only for growth but for good governance as well. We must move away from a zero-sum political mindset and towards a consensus-driven national vision. One that recognizes that economic prosperity cannot be sustained without political legitimacy, and political legitimacy cannot endure without economic opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, Bangladesh's future will not only determine the election alone, not for economic policies in isolation, not by economic policies in isolation. It will be shaped by how well we align democracy, governance, and economic strategy into a coherent national direction. Platforms like today's seminar are therefore extremely valuable. They allow us to listen, to reflect, and to rethink our assumptions. I look forward to the insights of our distinguished keynote speakers and the discussion that will follow. I sincerely hope that today's dialogue will contribute to a more stable, inclusive, and forward-looking Bangladesh. I sincerely hope that the future government will work together with all the stakeholders, including the business community, to address the future challenges of economy and ensure sustainable growth for development. Thank you.
ধন্যবাদ জনাব মাহবুব রহমান শিবকে। আমরা আমাদের প্রেজেন্টার ডক্টর মাহিন খানের যে বক্তব্য সেটার উপর আমরা কিছু আলোচনা করব, কিন্তু মাহবুব রহমান সাহেব একটি বিষয় উত্থাপন করেছেন যে এখন আগামীতে যেহেতু নির্বাচন, সবই নির্বাচন নিয়ে কথা, এবং সেই সাথে একটা কথা বলেছেন যেটা আমি বুঝতে পারলাম না, যে হ্যাঁ ভোটের কথা। হ্যাঁ ভোট মানে কি? তো আমার সুবিধা হয়েছে যে আমাদের সাথে আজকে উপস্থিত আছেন বাংলাদেশের সংবিধান বিশেষজ্ঞ ডক্টর স্বাধীন মালিক। তিনি আমাদেরকে একটু বুঝিয়ে বলবেন হ্যাঁ ভোটের রাইট কি আমার আছে, না গণভোটে হ্যাঁ না কথা আমরা বলবো, সেই জিনিসটা আমাদের সংবিধান বিশেষজ্ঞ আমাদেরকে একটু বুঝিয়ে বলবেন। তার আগে আমরা যে অর্থনীতির কথা আলোচনা করেছি সে অর্থনীতিটা করে নেই। আমাদের সাথে বিশিষ্ট ব্যবসায়ী বাংলাদেশে যিনি আন্তর্জাতিকভাবে সমন্বিত একে আজাদ সাহেব, যার কথা একটু আগে মাহবুব রহমান সাহেব উত্থাপন করেছেন, তার কথা শুনবো। আমাদের অর্থনীতির কথা শুনে অর্থনীতির সাথে নির্বাচন রাজনীতিবিদ আছে, তাদের কাছ থেকে রাজনীতির কথা শুনবো। তো তার আমি অর্থনীতিটাকে শেষ করে নিই। আজাদ সাহেব, একে আজাদ, হামিদ গ্রুপ অফ ইন্ডাস্ট্রি আমরা সবাই জানি।
ধন্যবাদ অ্যাডভোকেট রুকসানা খন্দকার আমাকে সুযোগ দেওয়ার জন্য। আমি স্যারের ডক্টর মঈন খানের সরাসরি ছাত্র না, আমি ওনার সঙ্গে ছাত্র না, আমার বন্ধুরা আমার ছাত্র। এখন আমার মনে হচ্ছে মেহরানের আমার ছাত্র হইতে হবে। মেহরানের প্রেজেন্টেশন আই লাইক সো মাচ, এত ডেপথে গেছে, তো মেহরানের ক্লাস করতে হবে, আবার ছাত্র হইতে হবে। তো রিয়েলি আই অ্যাপ্রিশিয়েট এবং উই আর প্রাউড অফ ইউ। এত ডেপথে গিয়েছে, অনেকগুলো তথ্য সে নতুন করে উপস্থাপন করেছে, সে কারণে আমি তাকে কংগ্রেচুলেট করি। এবং তার মতো মেধাবী আমাদের বাংলাদেশের আগামীতে দরকার আছে, কারণ এই মেধা শুধু এই অক্সফোর্ডে থাকলে হবে না, এটা বাংলাদেশের জন্য দরকার, বাংলাদেশ সরকারের জন্য দরকার, ব্যবসায়ীদের জন্য দরকার। আমি মেহরুন যেটা বলেছেন যে আমাদের 2 মিলিয়ন প্লাস লোক প্রতি বছর জব মার্কেটে আসে, এটা একটু বেশি, কারণ আমাদের ছোট সত্যিকার স্ট্যাটিস্টিক্স নাই। স্ট্যাটিস্টিক্সটাও করায় সরকার, যে করে চায় স্ট্যাটিস্টিক্সের রিজাল্ট ওইভাবেই আসে। তো অলমোস্ট 2.5 million people is coming every year to the job market. She has correctly pointed to 12% is going to the garment sector, 7% is going to abroad, আর বাকিটা বেকার থাকে। এই যে আমরা লোকগুলো পাঠাচ্ছি কারাকে পাঠাচ্ছি, যা লো আর্নিং পিপুল, রাস্তা পরিষ্কার করে, ইট টানে, কনস্ট্রাকশনে কাজ করে, এদেরকে ফিলিপাইন পিপুল, আমি রিপিট করতে চাই না, এই যে কারাকে ডেপ করেছে, এইটা আমাদের গভর্নমেন্টকে বুঝতে হবে। এখানে স্যার আছেন, স্যার তো আমরা চাচ্ছি আল্লাহর রহমতে, আমাকে যদি কেউ জিজ্ঞাসা করে বাংলাদেশে মহামান্য রাষ্ট্রপতি কে হইতে পারে, আমি স্যারের নাম বলবো, মহামান্য রাষ্ট্রপতি স্যার হবে, কারণ ওনার মতো একজন সৎ, জ্ঞানী, এবং এই যে তার বোঝা যায়, পরিবার দেখলে একটা লোককে চেনা যায়। দেখেন মে 3টারে কিভাবে করেছে, আমার মতন ব্যবসায়ী তো করে না, কারণ আমার মতো ব্যবসায়ী করতে হলে ওই আন্ডার টেবিলে দিতে হইতো, আবার ওইভাবে আর্ন করতে হইতো। কিন্তু মেয়েদেরকে মেধা, যে ছোটবেলা পড়ছে না, বিদ্যা এমনই ধন, যত করিবে দান তত যাবে পেয়ে। তো মেয়েদের নিজেও বিদ্যা শিখেছে, বিদ্যা দান করেছে, মেয়েদেরকেও ওইভাবে করেছে। তো সেই কারণে আমি স্যারকে এবং ম্যাডামকে দুজনকে প্রতি আমি কৃতজ্ঞতা অভিনন্দন জানাই। আর আমি ভবিষ্যতেও স্যারের সাথে যদি কোনো কাজে কোনো ব্যাপারে সম্পৃক্ত হতে পারি, যে মিলেনিয়াম ইউনিভার্সিটি যেটা করেছে, তা আমি মনে করি, আমি ঢাকা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ের ছাত্র না, আমি 6 বছর ঢাকা ইউনিভার্সিটির অ্যালামনাইর সভাপতি ছিলাম। অ্যালামনাইর সভাপতি যখন হলাম, তখন আমি দেখলাম যে আমার এই করণীয় কাজটাকে, ফার্স্ট আমার ফান্ডামেন্টাল কি, আমি কিভাবে এই ছাত্রদেরকে পাশে দাঁড়াইতে পারি। তো প্রথমে যে মেডিকেল, আমি আজ থেকে 40 বছর আগে ঢাকা ইউনিভার্সিটিতে পাশ করে আসছি, তারও বোধহয় বেশি। তো 40 বছর আগে যখন সেই মেডিকেল ছিল আমরা গিয়ে ডাক্তারকে বলতাম এই ওষুধ লেখেন, ডাক্তার তাই লিখে দিত। এই 40 বছরও ঠিক তার কোনো উন্নতি হয় না, সেই মেডিকেলই আছে। আমি বললাম যে আজ ঢাকা ইউনিভার্সিটি 100 বছরের উপরে, এখানে পালিত একটা ডিপার্টমেন্ট আছে, পালিত উর্দু, তারপরে সংস্কৃতি, এই সব ডিপার্টমেন্টের আদৌ দরকার আছে কিনা। এই ডিপার্টমেন্ট একটা সাবজেক্ট থাকতে পারে, পালিত একটা সাবজেক্ট থাকতে পারে, উর্দু একটা সাবজেক্ট থাকতে পারে, এই প্রত্যেকটার জন্য একটা ডিপার্টমেন্ট, এবং সরকারের হাজার হাজার কোটি টাকা খরচ হচ্ছে, এবং কার টাকা? পাবলিক মানি। তো এই যে আমরা এখনো এই যে লোকজন নেই, আমরা এমপ্লয়মেন্ট নেই, যখন বিজ্ঞাপন দিই 2-1টা প্রাইভেট ইউনিভার্সিটি ভালো, এখনো কিন্তু ইকোনমিতে এবং সার্ভিস সেক্টরের কন্ট্রিবিউশন রাখছে গভর্নমেন্ট ইউনিভার্সিটিগুলো। এখনো কোয়ালিটি এডুকেশন গভর্নমেন্ট ইউনিভার্সিটিতে যাওয়া হচ্ছে, প্রাইভেটে কিন্তু সেগুলো হচ্ছে না। অনেক প্রাইভেট ইউনিভার্সিটি হচ্ছে শুধু সার্টিফিকেট সংঘর্ষ। আমার মনে হয় এইগুলো আমাদের সামনে আলোচনা করতে হবে, যে আমাদের কোয়ালিটি এডুকেশন ছাড়া কিন্তু জাতি আগাবে না। আমাদের জাতি যে শিক্ষা দেখছি যে হারে ইউনিভার্সিটি হচ্ছে, আর কোয়ালিটি এডুকেশন আমরা দিতে পারছি না এই জায়গায়। আর শিক্ষা দান, আমি আজ পর্যন্ত ইথিক্যালি আমার কাছে অনেক ইউনিভার্সিটি আমার কাছে আমাকে জয়েন করতে হচ্ছে, আমি করিনি। আমি একটা জায়গায় যে আমরা ইউনিভার্সিটিতে পড়ে আসছি, সেই স্কুল প্রাইমারি থেকে ইউনিভার্সিটি পর্যন্ত অলমোস্ট বিনা পয়সা, সাধারণ মানুষের পয়সা। আর আজকে শিক্ষাটা কমোডিটি হয়ে গেছে, আজকে কমোডিটির মতো শিক্ষা, যার জন্য কোয়ালিটি এডুকেশন হচ্ছে না। এখানে শিক্ষা বাণিজ্য হচ্ছে, এই জায়গা থেকে কিন্তু আমাদেরকে সরতে হবে। আজকে যদি ইকোনমির কথা বলি, ইকোনমি কোথায় আমি আছি দেখেন, বাংলাদেশ ব্যাংকের যে আমার কাছে স্ট্যাটিস্টিক্স আজকে, এটা হলো 1 তারিখে পাবলিশ হয়, উইকলি এটা পাবলিশ হয়। এখানেতে প্রাইভেট সেক্টর আমরা যারা এই কর্মসংস্থান দিব, তাদের জন্য লোন স্যাংশন আছে, কিন্তু কেউ নিতে পারে না, কারণ হাই ইন্টারেস্ট রেট 6%। আর সরকার ব্যাংক থেকে লোন নিয়েছে 2 সপ্তাহ আগে ছিল 27%, এটা বেড়ে এখন হয়েছে 32%। আগামী দিন যারা সরকারের 12 তারিখের পরে যারা সরকার আসবেন, এইটা 35-40% চলে যাবে। আর যদি আল্লাহর রহমতে 114% যদি গভর্নমেন্ট সরকারি কর্মকর্তাদের বেতন বাড়ায় 114%, সাথে সাথে উঠবে প্রাইভেট সেক্টরের বেতন বাড়াইতে হবে। তাহলে পুরোটাই ব্যাংকে যা টাকা আছে এইটা গভর্নমেন্টের লাগবে, এটা প্রাইভেট আর অন্য কোন কাজ হবে। তাহলে কারণ কি অবস্থা? কারণ কি? আজকে জিডিপি 3.97 25-এ, তার আগের বছর ছিল 4.22, 24-এ যেখানে 0.24, এখানে এখন 3.97 ইজ গোইং ডাউন। কেন? দেশে বিনিয়োগ নাই। বিনিয়োগ নেই কেন? ব্যাংকের তরল সংকট। আর বিদেশিরাও এখানে বিনিয়োগ করে কেন? কারণ এখানে আমাদের দেশীয় তো, আমি সেদিনও একটা অনুষ্ঠানে বলছিলাম যে আমাদের এনার্জি সংকট, এক্সিস্টিং ইন্ডাস্ট্রি যার সেটা হচ্ছে এনার্জি নাই, লোডশেডিং, ডিজেল দিয়ে আমাকে চালাতে হচ্ছে, আই এম নট কস্ট ইফেক্টিভ। আমি যখন বিনিয়োগ বাড়াতে পারছি না, তাহলে বিদেশিরা এখানে বিনিয়োগ করবে কেমনে? আমার স্যার শ্রদ্ধেয় আরেক শিক্ষক, বাংলাদেশের প্রধান উপদেষ্টা, তারে বললাম, স্যার আপনি যে এত বড় বিনিয়োগ করতে জন্য একটা সেমিনার করতেছেন, কোটি কোটি টাকা খরচ করে, স্যার এই টাকাটা আমাকে দেন স্যার, আমি এটাতে গ্যাস কিনি। 5,000 দরখাস্ত পড়ে আছে এখানে, লোকাল ইনভেস্টররা যদি এদেরকে দেওয়া হয় তাহলে আরো 2 কোটি লোকের কর্মসংস্থান। আমি কয়েকদিনের জন্য আমি সবকিছু ইকোনমি পলিটিক্স সবই নিয়ে আসতেছি এর মধ্যে। আমি 7 মাসের জন্য স্বতন্ত্র এমপি ছিলাম। তো একজন, আমাদের তো সিট নাই, সিট ছিল একদম হলো ইয়ের কাছে, বিরোধী দলের পিছনে। নরমালি সরকারি দলের এমপিরা ওইরকম কিছু বলেন না, তারা পার্লামেন্টে যান, তারা ওই যে যিনি সংসদীয় কমিটির চেয়ারম্যান থাকেন, উনি চোখের ইশারা উনি যেভাবে দেন বক্তব্য ঠিক ওইভাবে হবে। আর সংসদীয় কমিটির চেয়ারম্যান যিনি থাকেন তার বাবা বা দাদা যদি কিছু থাকে তার সম্বন্ধে তো 1-1.5 মিনিট বলতে হয়। তারপরে সংসদীয় কমিটির চেয়ারম্যান সম্বন্ধে বলতে হবে, তার সন্তানদের কথা বলতে হবে। তো 3 মিনিট তো চলে গেল, থাকে 5 মিনিট, 5 মিনিটের 3 মিনিট চলে গেল এইভাবে, আর থাকে 2 মিনিট। 2 মিনিট তার বাবা যদি আবার মন্ত্রী এমপি থাকে তাহলে 1 মিনিট চলে যায়, তার থাকে আর 1 মিনিট। ওই 1 মিনিট এলাকার সমস্যা করতে করতে স্পিকার লাল বাতি জ্বালায় দেয়। এইটা হচ্ছে সংসদের আমি অভিজ্ঞতা বলতেছি, যেটা পার্লামেন্ট আমরা 12 তারিখে যাদেরকে ভোট দিয়ে নির্বাচিত করতে। আর আমরা যারা স্বতন্ত্র তাদের হাত উঠাইলেও ওই স্পিকার ওই দিকে তাকায়। বিরোধী দলের নেতাকে বলে, বিরোধী নেতার থেকে 1-2 বলার সুযোগ পায়, সরকারের দলের লোকেরা। আমি তো বললাম এই পার্লামেন্টের খুব একটা পরিবর্তন হবে বলে আমার মনে হয় না সামনে দিকে আসতেছে। আমাকে এটাকে সাংবাদিকরা আবার অন্যভাবে নেন না। তাহলে কি করতে হবে? আমাদের ভিতরে যে আমাদের এমন লোককে নির্বাচিত করতে হবে যে সাহস করে কথা বলতে পারে, যে আমার সমস্যা তুলে ধরতে পারে, আমার এলাকার সমস্যা, আমার এলাকার সারা সমস্যা কি, আমার এলাকার এই যে আমার এলাকা আমি যেখানে এমপি দাঁড়াইছি আমার মূল সমস্যা কি, চাঁদাবাজি। আমার মূল সমস্যা কি, এই সন্ধ্যার পরে ঘুমাইতে পারে। কোথায় চাঁদা হয়? বালি কেটে নিচ্ছে নদীর থেকে। আমি সংসদ সদস্য হওয়া